Have a good look at this building. What do you see? Well, you see a building. We become aware of the form, the subject, the object of a building when we see this photo. But how often when we look at a drawing of a building such as this, or of anything really, the first thing that hits us is a lot of black lines, and then we have to read past all these black ink lines that draw attention to themselves in order to see what they are. What we want, if we want to draw realistically, is we want the emphasis of what we see at the end to be the emphasis of what we see in our reference, to the degree anyway that our reference captures reality. So I don't want a lot of equal, heavy, or at least consistent, smooth black lines, continuous black lines. This is one of the biggest reasons why our drawings can have a cartoon-like effect when we don't want them, because that's the sort of line work we have for cartoons. Instead, I want the, if you like, the visual effect of a building to emerge at the end, and the lines, or rather the marks, the ink that we put on the paper to achieve that is a means to an end, and we don't notice that means ahead of noticing what they're all adding up to, which is the effect of a building. Look, I hope that makes sense, because it in some ways is a subtle but a vital difference. Often when we see a drawing of a house that's made of bricks, where there's been an effort made to draw all the bricks, or at least a lot of them, the visual effect is all these lines for bricks, and we see that first, and we see that ahead of seeing a brick wall. We see a grid of lots of black ink on the paper, and it makes that wall look darker in our drawing than it does in life, in our reference. So this is what we're trying to overcome. So you'll notice my pen, and it's a 0.2 Unipin fine line pen. I'm holding it in a way to try and get the lightest lines possible. It's a brand new pen, so there's a very strong ink flow, which I always find a little bit of a challenge most of the time. And so I'm holding it halfway down to get a nice light hold, to hold it very lightly against the paper and able to do fairly fast moves. That gives me far greater variety at the lighter end of the sort of marks and the sort of lines I can create. So what I want is to have, in many ways, as light a line as possible, so then I can go darker in different ways in parts to strengthen parts and create the sort of visual variety that we see in life. So, for instance, if we look at the right-hand wall of this house, well, it's really just a big room, but if we look at the corner on the right-hand side, what I see is a light shape, and I see it clearly because there's a dark value behind. I don't see a heavy black line that defines that edge. The edge is actually, if you like, very thin, because I'm not seeing a line at all. I'm seeing where a plane ceases to be, and it's highlighted by the dark values behind that. So using a pen that puts ink on the paper, I want to try and create that feel as much as possible. The windows are going to be a big challenge of this, because we do see darkness behind them, but we don't see black behind them. And if I were to colour in black what's behind the glass, I'm going to get a very dead, flat feel. And particularly when it's such a simple facade, I want to try and capture whatever feel I can. And so the effect of the light on the blinds, casting shadows and creating various values of lighter to darker, depending whether we have the blind behind or the room behind. I want to try and get as much of that using my pen as I can. I'm using the one pen throughout. I'm not switching to a lighter pen for certain parts. This drawing took me 25 minutes to do in real time, and it was more like 20 minutes if we take out the hatch-in for the left-hand side. I originally wasn't going to do that, and then I thought that, well, really, one of the significant things about this drawing, about this scene, this reference, is the bright sunshine. And so I can't create the feel of the bright sunshine and have it consistent over the whole building if I don't do the shade on the left-hand side, and then if I don't do the shadow on the grass as well on the left-hand side. And I could hardly do the shadow on the grass without doing the shade. And if you're not aware, shadow is darker than shade. If you have a look at this photo, that becomes clear. And also, shadow is cool in its underlying colour, whereas shade is warm. And again, if you look at these two examples of shade and shadow, you can see that that's true here. And it can be, this distinction can be heightened by the underlying local colour. So whether it's a bluey or a reddy toned colour in the first place, but the warmer or cooler effect still impacts that base. So here I am now holding my pen very lightly as I'm working at doing as much of the detail in the windows as I can. But equally, notice I'm not drawing heavy lines down for the divisions between the window panes. I'm trying to draw with as light a touch as possible. I want to include this detail because, quite frankly, as I said before, there's not much other detail to draw, so it adds a great deal of interest to a fairly simple building. But I don't want to have a lot of heavy black lines because that's not the effect I get when I see the windows. I don't see lines outlining the windows. First of all, I see the light moving through the windows. And while there are always, of course, limitations in capturing life with a pen, I want to minimize those and I want to maximize the realistic effects I can capture with my pen. Now, when we're trying to draw realism, then accuracy in our forms is obviously part of it. So I need to make sure that my perspective angles are the same as in my reference, or at least in terms of my drawing, they're consistent in the drawing so that they look real. So that's a given when we're trying to capture realism. If the drawing looks impossible because the perspective angles don't line up correctly with each other, then that's the obvious giveaway that this does not look real. But beyond that, we're needing to mimic in our drawing, in our ink work, in the marks we choose and how we choose to put them on the paper. We choose to mimic the overall effect we see in life. At a glance, what do I notice? I want that to be what I notice in my drawing. And so now I've basically done the outline, and I was going to pretty much finish at this point, but I thought, no, look, in the end, why not experiment with the hatching and really sharpen the sense of sunlight on this building, because it was a very bright, glary day. It was very hot, even though we're actually in Tasmania, the southernmost state in Australia. It was very hot and very bright. And what we get with that is very, very stark areas of shade and shadow and sunlight. There's nothing in between. And again, there are shadows being cast on the slight variations of thickness on the windows and around the windows and around the doors. So I want to capture those because they also give a sense of the three dimensions, but I don't want it to be too strong. I don't want it to stand out more in my drawing than it does in my photo. So a little bit of just trying to work out what direction am I going to do the lines, and I decide to do them at an angle, not vertically. And then after I did one layer of hatching in this way, I decided that it needed to be a little bit darker, so I did another layer of hatching at a different angle over the top. So I crossed my hatching, and that's the difference between hatching and cross hatching. Hatching is one layer of lines, and cross hatching is where we put another layer of lines over the top at a different angle, which darkens the value that we create. And this is a pretty handy trick if we want a nice sharp edge to our hatching and yet we want to go fast. If it's a very dark hatched area and I want my lines to be heavy, then I can go slowly. Or if my style is a little stylistic, and that suits. But if I want a light hatching, then it's hard to slow down the lines, because then the ink starts to flow more strongly. And so a sheet of paper preserving the white is a great way to be able to do fast hatching and therefore get minimal ink on the paper and yet finish in a straight edge. And so now I'm hatching the chimney. I decided to hatch that separately just to help it feel a little more three-dimensional. You'll find this reference on my channel community page if you want to have a go drawing it yourself. And please hit the like button if you've got to this point. As I said, I used a 0.2mm pen for this, and that made it a bit easier, I think, to avoid heavy line work. That would have made the line work more obvious, more impacting than the actual object that the line work is meant to be creating. It's not just about defining edges, it's about creating a sense of three-dimensional form. And even black lines is not always a good way to do it. It's possibly not often a good way to do it. And it doesn't necessarily take a huge amount of time. As I said, this drawing was 25 minutes. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I think one of the things that marks a transition from a beginner's mindset in drawing to a more, if you like, intermediate leading to advanced way of thinking when we draw is the transition from thinking of drawing lines to outline shapes to putting marks on the paper to create a sense of three-dimensional form and visually a stronger sense of reality, because real life isn't as simple as black lines around objects. There's a greater subtlety that we need to try and capture. I hope this has been helpful and at least been interesting, but whatever you draw, however you draw it, and however real or unreal it looks, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.